The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy. It possessed a physical weight, like a damp wool blanket draped over the furniture, pressing down on the air itself until breathing became a conscious, labored effort. I stood in the center of what had been my sister Elena's sanctuary, a trespasser in a shrine built to a life that had ended abruptly, violently, just 3 weeks ago. Outside, the October rain lashed against the single-pane glass of the Victorian window, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that sounded less like weather and more like fingers tapping, demanding to be let in. The storm had been raging for days, washing the city of Chicago in a palette of grays and charcoals, mirroring the internal landscape of my own grief. But inside this room, time had simply stopped. The air was stagnant, preserved like a museum exhibit. It still smelled of her, that complex, maddening, intoxicating blend of expensive Madagascar vanilla perfume and the sharp, acrid bite of stale cigarette smoke. It was a scent that used to frustrate me, clinging to my clothes after our lunches, but now, inhaling it felt like a betrayal. Every breath I took was a reminder that the scent was fading, molecule by molecule, dissipating into the ether, just as she had. I moved toward the mahogany vanity, my reflection in the dust-streaked mirror, looking back at me, a ghost of the woman I used to be. My hands, usually steady, manicured, and capable, trembled as I reached for a stack of cardboard boxes I had brought to pack away her life. How do you condense 40 years of vibrancy, of chaos, of brilliant, artistic madness into a brown cardboard box? It felt reductive. It felt criminal. I began with the books. Elena lived in her books. I picked them up one by one, feeling the cracked spines, the dog-eared pages, and then, buried beneath a chaotic pile of fashion magazines and unpaid bills, I found it, the diary. It was a battered thing, bound in cognac-colored leather that had darkened with the oils of her hands over the years. The spine was broken in 3 places, a testament to how often it had been opened, shut, and thrown across rooms in fits of passion. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew the rules. We had boundaries, Elena and I. But death has a way of dissolving the privacy of the living. I opened the cover. The pages were thick, cream-colored vellum. Her handwriting was a frantic scrawl, the blue ink pressed so hard into the paper that I could feel the ridges of the letters on the reverse side. I read snippets, feeling the voyeuristic guilt rise in my throat, but I couldn't stop. I flipped forward, past the summer, past September, until I reached the end, October 14th, the day she died, the day the car went off the bridge. The entry began, normally enough, detailing a lunch date, a complaint about the weather, but then, it stopped. My thumb traced the bottom of the page. It didn't end with a period, it ended in violence. The bottom half of the page was gone. It hadn't been torn out carefully. It had been ripped with a ferocity that left the binding exposed. Small, fibrous hairs of paper still clung desperately to the glued spine, jagged and uneven. I frowned, the silence of the room suddenly ringing in my ears. Elena never tore pages out of her diaries. I remembered her telling me once, years ago, over a bottle of Pinot Noir, that tearing out a page was a lie. Mistakes are part of the story, Martha, she had said, her eyes glittering. You don't edit your life. You just turn the page. So why this? Why now? Why on the day she died? The question gnawed at me, a cold little worm in my gut. As I finished packing the box, I sealed it with tape, the tearing sound harsh and final in the quiet room. Later that evening, I found myself back in my own home, a sprawling, modern glass fortress that felt sterile compared to Elena's cluttered nest. My husband, David, was already asleep upstairs. I could picture him there, soundly resting, unburdened by the crushing weight that sat on my chest. I couldn't sleep. The house was too cold, the heating system humming a low, artificial note that set my teeth on edge. I needed to move, to work, to do something with my hands to keep my mind from circling back to that torn page. I went to the laundry room. It was a mundane task, grounding in its simplicity. I sorted through the basket, separating the whites from the darks. Then I reached for David's heavy charcoal wool coat. It was the coat he had worn to the funeral, standing stoically beside me as they lowered the casket. It was the same coat he had worn the night the police came to our door to tell us about the accident. I held the coat for a moment, the coarse wool scratching against my wrists. It was heavy, damp with the lingering moisture of the persistent rain. I went through the ritual of checking the pockets, a habit born of 30 years of marriage. Usually, I found receipts for dinners I didn't attend, or perhaps a stray mint wrapper. I plunged my hand into the deep right pocket. My fingers brushed against the silk lining, finding nothing. I switched to the left pocket. My fingertips grazed against something hard. It wasn't a receipt, it was a ball. A tight, dense, compressed sphere of paper. It felt like a stone. It had been squeezed so tightly. I pulled it out, the sound of the dry, crinkled paper deafening in the tiled silence of the laundry room. I stood there for a moment, under the harsh fluorescent lights, holding this small, crumpled object in my palm. It vibrated with a strange energy, a nervous tension captured in the way it had been crushed. Why would David have a ball of paper in his funeral coat? David, who was fastidious, who ironed his handkerchiefs. Slowly, carefully, I placed the paper on the cool, white enamel of the washing machine. I began to uncrumple it. The fibers were soft, worn down from friction, as if someone had been rubbing it in their pocket for hours, perhaps days. I smoothed it out, pressing my palm flat against the wrinkles. The shape of the paper was undeniable. It was a bottom half. The top edge was jagged, ripped unevenly, a tear that spoke of panic and rage. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold wash of realization that made my knees weak. I knew this paper. I knew the texture of this cream vellum, and I knew the handwriting that slanted aggressively across the page. It was Elena's. I matched the jagged edge in my mind to the diary I had held hours ago. It was a perfect fit. I looked down at the words written there. The ink smeared slightly from the dampness of the coat. The first line jumped out at me, screaming in the silence of the laundry room. I told him it ends tonight. I told him I'm telling Martha everything. The fluorescent bulb above the washing machine flickered, casting a sickly, intermittent strobe light over the crumpled piece of paper in my hands. The hum of the dryer in the corner seemed to drop away, replaced by the rushing of blood in my ears, a sound like the ocean, vast and terrifying. I forced myself to read the rest. My eyes, stinging with dryness, traced the erratic loops of Elena's handwriting. It wasn't just a declaration of intent. It was a confession of a life I didn't know existed. 3 years, David. 3 years of sneaking around in the shadows of her life. The money is moved. The account in the Caymans is finalized, just like you wanted. But I look at her, and I see the sister who raised me. I can't disappear with you. The obsession with the money, it's rot, David. It's eating us alive. I told him it ends tonight. I told him I'm telling Martha everything. I gripped the edge of the cold enamel machine to keep from sliding to the tiled floor. 3 years, the words echoed in the sterile room. 3 years meant they were together while I was nursing David through his pneumonia. 3 years meant they were touching while we planned Elena's 40th birthday party. The betrayal wasn't a singular event. It was an architecture. They had built a cathedral of lies, brick by brick, right under my nose. The air in the laundry room suddenly felt too thin. My mind violently rejected the present, snapping back to a memory from 2 months ago. A dinner party. It had been a Tuesday. The dining room was bathed in the warm, amber glow of the chandelier. I remembered the sensory details with a sudden, painful clarity. The smell of roasting lamb with rosemary, the metallic taste of the cheap red wine David had insisted on opening, a vintage he usually claimed was beneath him. I was seated at the head of the table. David was on my right. Elena was on my left. I closed my eyes, and the scene played out against the back of my eyelids. I heard the sharp clink of silver forks hitting bone china. I heard the low murmur of jazz playing from the speakers in the study. I remembered looking up. David was pouring more wine into Elena's glass. The bottle was heavy in his hand. He didn't pull away immediately. As the crimson liquid settled in the crystal bowl, his hand lingered near hers on the tablecloth. His pinky finger brushed against her wrist. It wasn't an accident. It was a caress. A microscopic signal of possession. Elena had looked up at him then. At the time, I interpreted the look as shared sorrow. Our mother had passed away only a month prior, and I assumed they were bonding over the collective grief of the family. But looking back now, through the lens of this crumpled note, the look was entirely different. It wasn't sorrow. It was terror. It was the terrified intimacy of two people holding a grenade between them, waiting for the pin to drop. I remembered my own voice, naive and concerned, cutting through their silence. Is everything okay? David had flinched, just a fraction of an inch. He turned to me, his smile tight, his eyes failing to crinkle at the corners. Just tired, honey. Work is killing me. Work is killing me. I opened my eyes, the white walls of the laundry room rushing back into focus. the timeline began to stitch itself together in my mind. A tapestry of horror. Elena wrote this note on October 14th. She wrote that she was coming to tell me everything. That night, she was driving toward my house. The police report stated she was 2 miles away when her car hydroplaned off the bridge. She wasn't coming for a casual visit. She was coming to confess. She was coming to save her soul. And then, the darkest realization of all, the one that made my knees lock and my breath catch in a stranglehold. The note was in David's coat pocket. If Elena wrote this in her diary, tore it out, and got in her car to come to me, then the note was with her. It was in her purse, or in her hand, or in her pocket. David hadn't found this note in her bedroom. He hadn't found it in a drawer weeks later. He had this note because he took it from her. The image that flooded my mind was so visceral, I nearly read. I saw the rain-slicked road. I saw the twisted metal of Elena's convertible smoking in the ravine. And I saw David, not at home, waiting for the police call as he claimed, but there, standing in the mud, reaching into the wreckage. I remembered his shoes. When he came home from walking the dog that night, his Italian loafers were caked in heavy, red clay, the kind of clay you find by the riverbed, not on the paved sidewalks of our neighborhood. I had wiped them off for him. I had cleaned the evidence of my sister's crash site off his shoes with a damp cloth, worrying about the leather, while her body was cooling in the rain. He didn't find this in her room. I whispered to the empty room, my voice trembling. He took this from her body. A creak from above froze the blood in my veins. That it was the distinct, groaning protest of the third floorboard in the master bedroom. Someone was awake. Thump, drag, thump, footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving across the ceiling, directly above my head. David. The panic that surged through me was primal. I was a gazelle sensing the lion in the tall grass. I couldn't be found down here, staring at a washing machine at 2 a.m., clutching the evidence of his crime. If he saw my face, he would know. And if he knew I knew, what would he do? He had already watched one sister die. I had to hide it. I couldn't put it back in the coat. If he checked, he would know I had found it. I couldn't throw it away. It was the only leverage I had. With shaking hands, I folded the paper into a tiny square. The edges were sharp against my skin. I pulled the collar of my silk robe tight and shoved the paper down into my bra, pressing it against the soft flesh of my left breast. It felt cold and jagged, a physical reminder of the secret now burning against my heart. The footsteps stopped. Then, the faint sound of the bedroom door opening. He was coming out to the landing. I had to act normal. I had to walk up those stairs, enter that bedroom, and lie down next to a man who might be a monster. I turned off the laundry light, plunging myself into darkness, and began the long, terrifying ascent to the second floor. How do you sleep when you are lying next to the reason for your nightmares? The morning light that filtered into the kitchen was cruel in its clarity. It was a crisp, bright autumn sun that illuminated every dust mote dancing in the air, every smudge on the stainless steel appliances, and every line etching itself deeper into my face. The room smelled of burnt coffee, acrid and bitter, a mistake I had made because my hands had been shaking too violently to measure the grounds correctly. David stood by the microwave, using its reflective glass surface to adjust the knot of his silk tie. He looked immaculate. He looked like the man I had woken up next to for 30 years. He looked like safety. That was the most offensive part of it, all the terrifying normalcy of his silhouette against the morning light. He was humming a low, tuneless melody, the kind a man hums when his conscience is clear, or when he believes his secrets are buried 6 feet deep in the wet earth. I stood by the island, the granite cold against my palms. The paper in the pocket of my robe felt heavy, like a lead weight dragging my posture down. It burned against my hip, a radioactive isotope of truth that was about to poison everything in this room. David turned, flashing that easy, charming smile that had won over boardrooms and cocktail parties for decades. He checked his watch. "Have you seen my gray coat?" he asked, his voice casual, light. "The wool one. I need to drop it at the cleaners on my way in. It's got a bit of mud on the hem." The air in the kitchen vanished. The vacuum of his request sucked the breath right out of my lungs. Mud on the hem. The audacity of the mundane lie. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was constricted by a knot of pure, unadulterated rage. Instead, I reached into my pocket. My fingers curled around the warm, fibrous sphere I had recrumpled in the night. I pulled it out. I slammed it onto the granite island. The sound was sharp, brittle like a dry bone snapping. I pressed my hand flat over it, smoothing the crinkled edges against the stone, forcing the paper to yield, forcing the truth to lie flat between us. David stopped. His hand froze on his tie. He looked at the paper, then up at my face. The transformation was instantaneous. It wasn't a gradual dawn of realization. It was a collapse. The blood drained from his face so fast it looked as if a plug had been pulled. His skin turned the color of wet ash. His eyes, usually so confident, widened into saucers of panicked recognition. "It was in your pocket, David," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own, ears low, guttural, devoid of any warmth. "The page Elena wrote the night she died. The page that ends with her telling me everything." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish on a dock, gasping for oxygen that wasn't there. "Martha," he croaked, his voice cracking. He took a step toward me, reaching out a hand. "Martha, don't read that. It's not what you think. You don't understand the context." "The context." I laughed, a sharp, barking sound that had no humor in it. "The context is that you were sleeping with my sister. The context is that you were planning to leave me. The context is that you were moving my money to the Caymans." He flinched as if I had struck him. "It wasn't just the affair," he whispered, the fight draining out of him. He slumped against the counter, the veneer of the successful husband crumbling into dust. "It was the money." I was in deep. "Martha, deeper than you know. Elena, she found the transfers. She said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. She said she was going to the police." "So you killed her?" The question hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. "No," he shouted, tears suddenly springing to his eyes. "No, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to stop her. She called me from the car. She was screaming that she was coming here. I followed her. It was raining so hard. I just wanted to cut her off, to make her pull over so we could talk. I swerved. I just clipped her bumper." I stared at him. The room spun. "You ran her off the road." "I wanted to scare her," he sobbed, sliding down the cabinets to the floor. "But she overcorrected. The bridge, the railing gave way. I saw the headlights spin into the dark. I walked around the island. I needed to see him. I needed to see the monster." And then, he looked up at me, his eyes hollow. I climbed down. The embankment was steep. It was mud and shale. I slipped, tore my coat. When I got to the car, it was upside down. The smell of gas was overpowering. He paused, a shudder racking his body. "She was alive, Martha." The world stopped. The clock on the wall, the hum of the fridge, the beating of my own heart, it all stopped. "She was pinned," he whispered, staring at his hands as if they were covered in blood. "She was breathing shallowly. She looked at me. She knew me, and she was holding that paper. She was clutching it in her left hand, squeezing it so tight her knuckles were white. She was holding onto it like it was a weapon." I felt a scream building in my chest, a primal, animalistic thing that clawed at my throat. "I could hear the sirens in the distance," David said, his voice barely audible. "I knew if they found that note, if they found her alive and she told them, I would lose everything. The money, the firm, you." "So you didn't call 911, I stated, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "I reached in," he said, tears streaming down his face. I pried her fingers open. She tried to hold on, Martha. She fought me for it, but she was weak. I took the paper. I crumpled it up so she couldn't take it back. And then, I watched the light leave her eyes. The scream finally broke free. It ripped through my throat, a sound of pure agony. I grabbed the ceramic mug of cold, burnt coffee and hurled it at him. It smashed against the cabinet above his head, showering him in shards of white pottery and brown liquid. He didn't move. He just sat there in the debris of his confession. I stood over him, my chest heaving, the air in the kitchen thick with the smell of coffee and betrayal. I looked at the man I had loved for 30 years. I looked at the hands that had held me, the hands that had caressed my face. They were the same hands that had chosen a piece of paper over my sister's life. They were the hands that had pried open the fingers of a dying woman to save his own reputation. He wasn't just a cheater. He wasn't just a thief. He was something far worse. David looked up at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy he didn't deserve. "Martha, please, we can fix this. No one knows." I looked down at the crumpled ball of paper on the counter, then back at him. My silence was absolute. But as I stared into his terrified eyes, a new, cold thought crystallized in my mind. He thought the story ended with Elena's death. He thought silencing her was the end of his problem. He was wrong. The transformation of my home from a sanctuary of upper-crust domesticity into a crime scene took less than 45 minutes. The silent, suffocating atmosphere of the morning was shattered by the chaotic, strobing intrusion of the law. Red and blue lights washed over the living room walls, pulsating like a frantic heartbeat, staining the cream-colored wallpaper with the violent colors of emergency. I stood by the grand staircase, my arms wrapped tightly around my chest, watching the dismantling of my life. The front door was wide open, letting in the damp chill of the approaching storm. Beyond the threshold, I could see the neighbors gathering. They stood on their porches or peeked from behind heavy drapes, drawn to the tragedy like moths to a bug zapper. I saw Mrs. Gable from next door, clutching her cardigan, her eyes wide with that specific blend of horror and thrill that accompanies the misfortune of others. Then, they brought him out. David didn't look like the master of the universe anymore. Without his jacket, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie hanging loose around his neck, he looked deflated, small. The handcuffs were a jarring, industrial silver against his pale skin. 2 officers, young enough to be his sons, gripped his arms with professional indifference. As they reached the door, David stopped. He dug his heels into the expensive Persian rug, resisting the forward momentum just for a second. He turned his head to look at me. I don't know what I expected to see in his eyes. Remorse, anger, panic. Instead, I saw a terrifying, pathetic plea. He looked at me with the desperate hope of a child who believes that if he just apologizes sincerely enough, the broken vase will glue itself back together. He was silently begging me to intervene, to use my influence, to make this untidy reality disappear so we could go back to the lie. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I simply turned my back. I walked away from the door, toward the library, leaving him to the cold air and the judgment of the neighborhood. I heard the heavy thud of the police cruiser door closing, sealing him into a new world where his charm would be useless. The house grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy, pregnant silence of secrets. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a ruin. I sat down on the bottom step of the library ladder. In my lap lay the battered leather diary. On the small side table next to me, I had placed the crumpled ball of paper and a roll of clear Scotch tape. My hands were steady now. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I peeled a strip of tape from the roll, the sharp zzzzzzzt sound cutting through the quiet room. I opened the diary to the back, to the jagged, torn edge that had haunted me. I took the crumpled page, the confession, the evidence, the last words of my sister, and I lined it up. It wasn't a perfect fit. The paper had shrunk slightly from the moisture of the rain and the heat of David's pocket. The edges were fuzzy. The wrinkles were deep, permanent scars that distorted the handwriting. But I pressed it down. I applied the tape, smoothing it over the tear. It was ugly. The glossy finish of the tape caught the light, highlighting the damage rather than hiding it. It was a scar running down the center of the page, a visible seam where the truth had been violently severed and then clumsily reattached. I ran my fingers over the texture. Smooth vellum, rough tear, slick tape. It made me think about the nature of missing pages. We all have them. We all have chapters of our lives that we tear out, crumpling them up and shoving them deep into dark pockets, hoping the narrative makes sense without them. I had spent 30 years reading the book of my marriage, skipping over the plot holes, ignoring the inconsistencies, telling myself that the story was a romance when it was actually a tragedy. I realized then that I was just as guilty as David, in my own way, not of murder, certainly, but of negligence, of a willful, comfortable blindness. I had seen the lingering touches. I had noticed the strange phone calls. I had felt the distance growing between us like a continental drift, but I had chosen not to read those pages. I had chosen the safety of the edit. I wanted the polished final draft of a happy life, not the messy, scribbled reality. We think the people we love are open books. We think that if we sleep next to them, eat with them, and age with them, we know every line of their story. But sometimes they glue the pages together. Sometimes they write in invisible ink, and sometimes they rip the pages out entirely, leaving us to read across the jagged gaps, making up our own bridges to get to the other side. I found the truth in a coat pocket, hidden in a ball of paper. But the reality is, I should have seen it in his eyes years ago. I should have seen it in the way he looked at her, not with familial affection, but with the desperate, consuming hunger of a man who wants what he cannot have. I closed the diary. The book was thicker now, swollen with the reinserted truth. It wouldn't close flat anymore. It sat on the table, warped and imperfect, just like the memory of my sister, just like the memory of my husband. I stood up and walked to the library window. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke. The rain came down in sheets, a gray curtain falling over the world. I watched as the water hit the asphalt of the driveway. It pooled in the tire tracks left by the police cruiser, swirling and diluting the mud, slowly washing away the evidence that David had ever been there at all. The house was empty. The bottle of wine was unopened. The secret was out. And for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library, waiting for you.